Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 362. I'm delighted to welcome onto the podcast Graham Norton. Graham, how's things?
Great, Ben. Cheers for having me on. Really appreciate it.
No, thank you for your time, mate. We've just been chatting, and I know you've got a hell of a lot going on at the minute. So we're going to dive into
Yeah,
it
yeah.
in a minute. But I appreciate you freeing some time up to come on the podcast
No
for us
problem at all.
today. Yeah, thank you, mate. We'll start where we always start, Graham. We always start on coaches, backgrounds, your sort of career up to this current point, because I know everyone feels like they've probably done similar sort of things, but we can take a hell of a lot of lessons from everyone's background. So can you give us a bit of a breakdown and a rundown that leads you up to what you're doing now?
Yeah, yeah. So I suppose to go from the start, I would have started out more of in the private sector, like doing personal training. Just did your generic personal trainer degree. Did a couple of months of that. I had a sporting background, like played football all my life, so I had a big interest in sport, and started to look up some strength and conditioning degrees and stuff like that, and then ended up enrolling in a bachelor's degree, but fully online. So I was able to work kind of full time in the fitness industry while doing that bachelor's, and that was 4.5 years. So throughout, I suppose my undergrad, I was working in the fitness industry. It was, I suppose, like a lot of people, ended up working in a kind of a small group training facility where a physio there was actually working with a team, and ended up getting a kind of a free internship with like a semi-professional football team over here. So they were in the kind of the top divisions, but it's changed now. But at that time, there was still some teams in the top division who were amateur. So it was with an amateur team technically. So I was, working full time in the industry, but that was my kind of way into the football world. And then completed my undergrad and was working. Then I actually moved to a full time professional team. So got headhunted, got asked to leave that club by this other team who were kind of top of the table at the time, and it was mid-season, so it didn't go down too well. But it was one of those when you get the call, you kind of have to make the decision, and that was a lot more intense. Like at this time, this team had qualified for the Europa League 2 years previous, which fairly common for a couple of English teams, but for the League of Ireland is almost unheard of. So they were kind of the top club. So they came in, asked me to come in there. So then that was a lot more full on. So I kind of went from, I suppose, an amateur setup, still training 3, 4 times a week with them, or kind of getting a feel of things, but moved then into, what was essentially a full-time position in football. So um, it's kind of stepped away from the, the fitness industry as such for a little while. Where I was kind of heavily focused on the football, but still was doing a couple of hours here and there. But went straight from then my bachelor's into my master's degree, which I did in St. Mary's in Twickenham, which is always obviously a fairly popular course. A lot of people go from there into football and such. So completed that only recently, actually only 2 years ago, completed that. And throughout that time, kind of progressed through in football. Had 4 years with that kind of successful Irish team that like managed to get to the Europa League stages again. 2 years into my time there, won the league, won cups, everything else. And then moved on to a club um, slightly closer to home for they were not at the same level, but again was kind of asked to move from the club I was with to them. And that's throughout this time I said I was still working in the private sector, and I had a gym with a business partner. So I was kind of my career in football, say up to now, was kind of about 8 seasons in total. And I was kind of started off, I suppose, heavily private and involved in the fitness industry, and then I suppose moved more into the football scene or the full time football environment. But throughout that time, I was kind of building up a small group personal training business, which has now kind of got to the point where we have 10 staff members, including myself, a business partner, and a couple of different units here in Dublin and Ireland. So really, I suppose, even mix, I would say, between I suppose experience in the professional football world, and then obviously the private sector, like just working with the general population. And then just recently, in the past year, so I've left football. We kind of have a family now, 2 kids, and needed to have maybe a little bit of time on the weekends, see what it's like, and moved into working in a rehab facility over in Ireland. Because this sports surgery clinic is kind of well known over here. It's kind of connected to a big hospital that would do a lot of surgeries. So it's kind of heavily rehab focused. Some general population um, people involved, but obviously a lot of athletes coming through the doors there. And then alongside that, I've started working in intercounty GA over here. So that's technically amateur, but kind of in terms of commitment from players and staff, it's nearly closer to professional without the actual status.
Awesome, mate. Awesome. I want to get into what you're currently doing in a little bit, but I want to just take us back to building the business a sort of alongside working in football, because probably there's a lot of coaches listening that might be on either side. They might be currently building, they might be currently working in the game. Not many will be doing both at the same time. How was that as a process for you in terms of building this business from scratch, I'm guessing, as well? And then also
Yeah, yeah.
keeping the day-to-day running of everything going at the club?
It's definitely challenging. I suppose even when I say private sector, we would actually be kind of, I would say, very general population focused. We do some work with teams. We get some athletes who kind of built up a reputation for ourselves for training, let's say, the general population in a more athletic way, but still it's kind of more so your typical gym goer who would come in, and I suppose that's a little bit different to a lot of S&Cs, because I think a lot of times you've seen this a lot around COVID. Around COVID there was a lot of talk around people kind of diversifying, and everyone got a bit scared, and they were like, geez, what if football's gone? What do we do? And everyone was talking about kind of side hustles, but then everyone's side hustles just ended up working online with athletes, and then people kind of realized there's not enough athletes to go around for everyone. Um, so and when I say the private sector, it is very kind of general population, not the most athletic, and that's where it is kind of completely separate. So it definitely was challenging. I suppose helped massively by, I have a kind of a 50-50 business partner, so when I was working in football, he was, here a lot, and, I suppose the basic thing is here a little in the actual business a little bit more than myself. So we can kind of split it that way. I think it would be very difficult to do without that specific situation for someone working in, say, full-time football. If the guy was there, whatever hours it would maybe, like we were in Europe at certain stages, working 12, 13 days in a row. And obviously, if you're running a business by yourself, that might not be feasible. So that's, I suppose, a caveat that I'd have to throw in there, that without that specific scenario, it would have been even more difficult than it was. But I suppose, like, the main thing how it kind of came about is I still have an interest, and I also do in terms of just train the general population. I just like coaching people generally. Obviously, it's great to be working with athletes and, like, let's say, the elite in terms of athleticism and everything like that. But in terms of, like, a lot of the processes and a lot of the kind of the hot thought behind the program, and seeing the work that you're doing with people, and the changes that you're making, I would get a similar have a similar interest in whether it's an athlete or the general population. So I've no problem kind of working in both areas, and that helps. I think the big thing that holds people back, or maybe coaches back in that area, is that their only real interest might be just, if someone's not playing the sport, they don't really want to work with that person. And whereas if you kind of open I suppose change your mindset a little bit, and kind of be a little bit more open to that, you might find that there's opportunities in that area a little bit more. But that's kind of how it came about for us, is that, as I said, I was working in football, but I still had that interest in the general population as well.
100%. No, that's a great point. How much do you think, because I talk about this a lot, maybe not so much on the podcast, but definitely off the podcast, that personal training and working with your general population clients can massively help when you step into a club environment. How much do you think that helped you as a coach, as a practitioner?
Yeah, I think it's massive. I mean, like, obviously, you can't say that athletes and the general population are the same, but they've a lot more similarities than they do differences, even in terms of the way they move. I think people maybe who are yet to come into the football world, maybe still in college, might be thinking, sure, athletes, they all move perfectly. They all move but that's definitely not the case. Sometimes
No.
you'd be shocked the fella who moves the most majestically on the pitch. You get him in the gym and he hasn't got a clue what he's doing. So, if you get a lot of practice, generally, it says, speaking general terms, general population are going to move a little bit worse, so they're a little bit harder to coach. So I suppose if you can coach those type of people, then you should find athletes a little bit easier. And even on I suppose the social aspect, I've had plenty of interns over the years who, even they had master's degrees, great CVs, but they'd never done any coaching. And then they come into a gym environment and even in a one-to-one setting, working with a player, they just really just don't have that confidence yet. Or even, in a small group of players, they've never kind of controlled the room, but they've never had to do it in a group of 20 females in a fitness class, so those type of skills, they are hard to build. And a lot of clubs, I think, would want you to nearly have those coming in, So it's kind of like, well, where do you get them? If most clubs want them coming in and you're not willing to work with the general population, then, where are you going to build those skills? So there's a lot of kind of invaluable skills, I think, that are there that, again, people aren't really, I don't think, open to, especially when they're starting out. They just kind of expect to just jump into that kind of full-time professional environment.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think it's really valuable, isn't it? Because you get that time. You've also not got the pressures, or I suppose the demands of games to deal with your general population clients. It gives you a bit of maybe experimental time with that client as well that you can take across the football, doesn't it?
Exactly, and you can try different things. Like there's certain things, like you said, you're going to get a certain period of the year, where you can kind of, like, let's say the off season, pre-season, where you can kind of really push the strength, and you might get maybe a block of 12 weeks, 16 weeks, where you get kind of consistent program and get to see that program follow through. But like for the most part, across the season, you're generally like kind of microdosing, throwing bits in here and there, and it's not as structured as, let's say, like your typical program isn't going to look like maybe the way you want it to be. Whereas if you're working with someone who, a general population client who just wants to get a bit stronger, you have the chance probably with that person, if you keep them for long enough, to maybe spend even 6 months or a year and get to see what a program, what are your skills like in terms of building a program for a person over the course of a whole year, and make those mistakes, like you said, not as if, like, obviously you're not trying to, you're doing your best, but when you're starting out, it's a little bit easier if you kind of make a bit of a programming error with a general population client than a star player of a team that you've somehow ended up with. So again, that practice in terms of, it's the same principles like behind strength training, behind power development, whatever it is, that apply. It's obviously just the level of the person that's in front of you, but you can still kind of work on all those skills. And again, in a slightly, like you said, lower pressure environment.
Definitely. Let's move into current day a little bit more now, because I know you mentioned about being involved with the clinic and the rehabs. How's that been for you? Is it like a career transition?
Well, I'm really enjoying it at the moment. Like, I'm into my second year of it now, and it's kind of it's a great environment to work in. Like, there's a lot of really like world-class physios there. A lot of them coming from professional environments or have just been in that environment for a long time. And I suppose the big benefit of it, from coming from a full-time professional environment, which I was in, for the 8 years previous to working here, you're working with physios, and for a lot of those years, it was with two kind of full-time physios. So they're taking vast majority of the rehab. You get a little bit of end stage, maybe with the player on the pitch, or a little bit of program with the gym, but a full-time physio team are going to do a lot of the rehab for you. Whereas in this environment, the S&Cs, once someone's been diagnosed with an injury, and you kind of know your do's and your don'ts, and you're getting that from sports docs, and from physios and specialists, you're really tasked with the rehab from very early stages. You could have someone with a 4C hamstring, these 2 weeks post-op, and you're bringing them all the way through the rehab, whereas you're just not really going to get that in a football, or let's say football, but a sporting environment, a full-time environment, because technically that's more so the physios area. So get a lot of really good experience with that kind of the early stage rehab that, again, I wouldn't have done as much of. I would have seen a lot of it from being in the environment with the physios, but in terms of actually having to program those early stages, and to do that, you have to obviously look into it a lot more. So it really helps to build your knowledge.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Is there anything that jumps out in terms of lessons from that, with you having to have control over that period? If you would put yourself back in the full-time football environment, what are some key things on that sort of return to play, the rehab process, especially the early stage rehab, that you'd maybe change in terms of your approach, or just be aware of a little bit more? Is there anything that jumps out?
I think, I suppose, the best example, or the one that I'd be on the best suited to talk about, would be the ACL injury, because that's the ones we see the most of. Actually, I don't know the exact figure, but it's in the thousands of ACLs that come through the doors each year. Huge, huge amounts. So a fair amount of our list would be ACLs. And I suppose when you're an S&C and you're kind of looking at ACLs, you probably are looking at, or even reading or interested in more of the late stage stuff. So you're really kind of looking into the kind of the power development, and like the what strength exercises are you going to do, or what kind of change direction drills you're going to get the back into. But I suppose I had to work in where I work now, I have to have a bit more respect for that kind of early stage. And because you do have people from that early point, you do get to see a lot of times you'll get someone maybe that they could have been 2 or 3 months with an external physio, and then for whatever reason, they might have either been referred or heard from someone, they decide to come and start doing rehab in the clinic. So they might have had a different start to their, let's say, their ACL journey, and maybe things might not have been ideal. Like, they haven't got their full range back. They still have a bit of pain, still a bit of swelling. And I suppose you really get to see the differences that can make in terms of how hard it is then at the latter stages, and how much that can kind of hold you back from doing all the, let's say, the interesting stuff, like your late stage stuff, your strength, power, speed, change direction. If people don't get that early stage right, it is very difficult to kind of to push on with that. And you nearly then have to kind of go back a little bit to come forward again, which people can find obviously very frustrating. So I suppose the big thing will be putting a bit more of an emphasis on that early stage, and not moving on from that until you've kind of ticked your boxes, like full range, pain free, no swelling, stuff like that, before you start adding, the higher intensity stuff, or let's say the riskier stuff.
So do you find that can alter the sort of timeline for that rehab, where you've seen, oh, they're not quite where I want them to be at the minute, so we need to just move things around? And if that wasn't the case, where you're involved in the early stage and they were just coming to you at that later stage, that could maybe change the timeline again, if that makes sense?
Yeah, definitely. And like, I suppose the thing that I really like about working in the place that I'm in at the moment is that it's pretty much all criteria based. I mean, I think a lot around ACL can be kind of timeline based. You should be running at 4 months, and then you should be doing change direction at 8 months, and you should be back at 9 months. Whereas that's just not the case whatsoever. That's probably ideals, but people have. But I'd say a lot of it comes from athletes. Probably all know someone who's done their ACL, and they speak to each other and like, oh, well, I was back in 9 months, so then therefore they're expecting to be back at that point, or I was back running at 4 months, so they think they'll be back running then. Because that's what we hear all the time. It's 4 months, I should be running now. Whereas when you look at their actual strength scores, or their power, or even just the range of motion that they have at the knee, and like, there's no way you should be running yet. And I suppose the clinic will be big on criteria based. So when someone gets full range, when someone has a certain deficit between limbs, whether that be strength or power, that's when you progress them on to whether it be running, change direction. And that's the way I would generally try to approach things for my own practice anyway, being a bit more objective. So that's kind of been a big thing that's helped.
Yeah, because there's been a few popular, and we won't name them, but there's been probably some famous players that have had rehab, especially ACL rehabs recently, and there's been clips coming out of the certain techniques and things being used on those players.
Yeah.
But that, like you say, that in the early stage, which has maybe led them to change the approach they take, whether on who they're working with, or whoever it is, it's really important, isn't it? And that could essentially have, if we're looking at a time scale, that could have changed it a lot, couldn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. I think like social media is just, I think you're trying to manage it so much now, because, people are coming in with all these ideas, not just people they know, but things they've seen on social media, just to be just a random video that popped up for them. You should be doing this exercise for your knee. And then, it could be a terrible idea for, where they're at. So that has such a big impact. So you're having so many conversations around that of just trying to get the person to focus on, where they're at individually. A lot of people don't even understand the procedures they've had, or how serious they might be. Someone's friend might have had just your basic ACL, like complete ACL tear, but no other complications. And then that person might have had, MCL, ACL plus MCL plus, tele dislocation, all these things. but then be still expecting to get back in the same time scale.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of kind of, I suppose, education around it as well, because people are just kind of picking up information from everywhere, and then I suppose allowing that to kind of get into their heads of where they should be at certain times.
So as well as understanding this early stage more, which I think that'll make sense to a lot of coaches, not necessarily to be leading on that stage, because like you said, in a club, that's probably going to be led by your physios, isn't it? But maybe understanding that better is a key point. Is there anything else
Yeah.
that jumps out to you? Maybe advice to coaches at clubs where you've dived into this rehab process. What do we need to understand more? Is there anything else?
A big one is probably understanding like change direction mechanics, running mechanics, and it is, I suppose, a long-term injury is kind of a rare opportunity to maybe change some of that. And I say rare, I suppose there is some evidence I think most people are aware of now in terms of like pelvic position and sprinting and how we can change that over time.
Mm.
But it is, I think everybody knows who's worked in full-time football, if you've got someone who moves really poorly and they're in, they're not injured, they're just in your day-to-day structure of training, like it is very hard to, let's say, significantly change, let's say, poor or not ideal run mechanics
Mm.
versus a long-term injury. It's a really good opportunity to kind of work on a lot of that.
Yeah.
So I suppose understanding what good movement looks like, whether it be from a change direction point of view or a max velocity point of view, and then I suppose having that picture in your head and I suppose implementing some of the key ideas early on and having that idea and being able to progress that through the rehab so that they end up, in a position where they're even though they're post injury, they're moving better than they did in the first place. I think that's very important. You're not, if someone does have things to work on, you should be using the time you have with them with the long-term injury to try and improve some of those things, even if it's not directly related to the injury itself. It is time that's there that they can, I suppose, they won't get when they're back into kind of, let's say, the normal team structure. So utilizing that will be a really important thing.
And like you said there, the time with a player, especially an individual player within a team setting, is quite rare to spend so much time with one person, isn't it? So it does really give an opportunity. And I suppose that's where it's different. You probably experienced it in the private world more, that's such a big change, isn't it, from the team environment, apart from a rehab.
Yeah, like time, and I suppose buy-in as well. I mean, I
Yeah.
always kind of joke like with the staff that are here, they don't realize because a lot of them they do, I suppose, bits in team sports, but they haven't been kind of say in a full-time environment. And even the attitude of people who are coming to pay you like directly out of their own pocket, when you're demonstrating an exercise, when you're telling them something, they kind of hang off every word. And when you're in the team environment, you're constantly fighting for attention. You could be talking about the most interesting thing in the world and the thing that's guaranteed to improve a player's performance, but they're still looking out the window or, punching their mate beside them, trying to get their attention. So like that will be one of the big differences is like obviously the time you have with someone, but not only just the time, it's how invested that person is when they're there with you, purely because a lot of the time it's the cost. If someone's paying you a reasonable amount of money for an hour of your time, like they're going to be fully bought in that time versus if someone's made to be there with you, even if they do or don't want to be there, like it's going to be a slightly different scenario. And that's where I think, I suppose, the private sector, even from a sporting perspective, like the one-to-ones of football and stuff that's more common out, that does have the upper hand because players are choosing to be with that person. So there's automatically, far greater buy-in than say being, made to do a gym session with the team S&C, who more than likely is like the elite of S&C, and they still probably want to be somewhere else with someone else, but that's just the nature of it.
Yeah, 100%. How much have you learned from working in GAA now as well, in terms of lessons to revert back in? I'm not saying that you can step back into football, but
Yeah,
if you
yeah.
did, like, is there anything that we can take away from working with those players in that team environment?
Well, I would have always worked in, I suppose, like Club GA over here, which is the Intercounty GAA, which is what I'm working at the moment. That's kind of a collection of the best club players and environment. And I suppose going into intercounty now, or even at the club level, compared to football, there is a lot more kind of pulling lads back and then kind of pushing them on. Like so
Okay.
many of the kind of the hunger they have for, I suppose, doing more and more and more all the time is crazy.
Oh, okay, right. So they want
That
to do
kind of
they
the
want to do
mindset.
more.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like it's more gym, more is better all the time. More running, like more high speed running is better. More training is better. Off-peak conditioning, gym, everything has to be. Oh, if we do more, we'll be better. Whereas like sometimes you're trying to educate them. Well, no, better is better.
Mm.
So I suppose you're kind of those skills are probably working with a different mindset of athletes because when you're working football a long time, I suppose the skill you're building all the time is how to get lads to buy in to just do what you want them to do.
Yeah.
Whereas I suppose in GAA you have to switch a little bit more to how can you convince lads maybe not to do all of this stuff all the time.
That's quite a difference, though, isn't it? I don't know. I
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
joke about it, but there's a skill in both sides, isn't there? There's a skill in the sort of the sales or the buy-in of getting players to no, this will help, and this will help because of X, Y, and Z, which is a lot of what the discussions we have on this podcast. Well, then there's the skill on the other side of exactly what you've just talked about there. Better is better, not just more all the time. There's a real sales pitch within that as well, isn't there?
Yeah, well, and I suppose, I mean, I'm definitely generalizing. I think we all know in a team, you do have those certain players in a team environment. You have a certain group of players who, are, let's say it's football players who are really going to want to push and just work more all the time. But I suppose in football, a lot of the time, it is more pitch based. I found like, like in the football world in GAA, it is more physical aspect. They kind of feel like they always need to be kind of physically better, whereas I think from a football perspective, you don't get it as often. It's kind of like more time on the pitch. We've just
Yeah.
done an hour and a half, 2 hour session. Oh, but I want to do all these extras. I was like, well, today might not be the day to do those extras. So, it's kind of, I suppose, learning, when to have those conversations. Because obviously then you're working, I suppose, against managers as well. Managers might want certain players out practicing, and they might be kind of coming to you, giving out, saying, "Oh, why did you tell him to, come in off the pitch? He's doing X, Y, and Z." Whereas you can see that the risk was quite high just on that day. So it is kind of, I suppose, learning that kind of individual when to have that conversation or how to with certain players within a group. But yeah, generalizing, I said, it is a little bit of a probably having to do a little bit less than the GAA side and a little bit more, say, on the football normally from a gym perspective anyway.
It's an interesting one on the extras, though, isn't it? Because there's been cases over the years where we speak about some of the players that probably retired now, where you said, "Oh, well, they stayed on." Like Beckham, for example, there was loads of chat around him staying on the pitch after training for hours,
Yeah,
practicing free kicks. So there's that education side, isn't there? That was obviously very much on the technical side, but I think, especially in the off season, I think you saw a lot of players spending time on the pitch, but turning it into more conditioning.
yeah,
They were doing a lot of work, a lot of running, which was essentially the off season period where they maybe needed a bit more recovery. So being on the pitch can mean a number of different things, can't it? Like
yeah,
in the gym, doing a gym session can mean a number of different things, can't it? And it comes down to education, doesn't it? A lot of the time.
yeah. Like as well as I suppose looking at the context, like I suppose earlier on your career, you're working with teams, you're very hard line and everything. You're looking at the iPad and the load is high for the day, and you're trying to drag everyone off the pitch, and you're it's the end of the world, because they're doing a couple of extra drills themselves versus you kind of learn when to kind of I suppose pick your battles, and there might be certain players that are higher risk, and from their background of injury or even the drill, the extras that type of doing, if someone's just off the back of a quad injury and they've just done, an hour and a half session, a small set of games, and now they want to do a load of shooting, probably like, okay, let's not do that. Versus, if they're just doing a little bit of something tactical, which is completely, I suppose, different to what they've just done in the actual pitch content itself, that might be okay. So I suppose it's taking in the whole situation and not being real hardline about, oh, okay, if anyone's done a tough session, then no one's doing extras, and really trying to enforce that. And again, you know, that would have been something I think everyone struggles with in early trying to have too much control earlier on in your career, and catastrophizing everything, making it. Whereas when you look at the kind of situation, you do realize you need to be a little bit more clever and kind of pick your battles at certain times.
I suppose it's how you put it across to people as well, isn't it? Because I know they spoke about it. I think it was on the overlap. They were talking about it, and they brought up that sports scientists were like tapping their watches and telling players to get off the pitch and all the rest
Yeah,
of it. And I think Rooney had a bit of input on it and stuff like that. But obviously, ex pros and that discussion was in a point of saying that it was maybe being too controlling and holding players back, not pushing them hard enough, and all the rest of it, which is obviously not the intention of
Yeah.
the coach. The intention of the coach is to keep them available, isn't it? But there's probably a mismatch in not necessarily what we're trying to do, but more how it's put across to the coaches.
Yeah, definitely. And like it is I suppose an education thing. You're trying to like I've worked with coaches before and kind of constant arguments back and forth. It was like, oh well, how are the lads ever going to get fitter? We can't push them on certain drills as you're trying to educate them then. Well, we can't push them further than we have before, but just to a certain point,
Mm.
it's the increase that's important. We are going to increase the amount they're doing just over a certain amount of time. And whereas, a coach, kind of was there, I suppose a lot of them I think it maybe changed a little bit now. Slightly younger coaches and maybe a little bit more methodical in what they do. But I suppose more old school coaches, there isn't as much thought behind it, as much thought behind it. And they want to throw in a load of conditioning on top of what was already a big session in a big week. And then they've got kind of a problem when you're I suppose suggesting against that. Whereas you're not suggesting against conditioning in general. It's more so the when and the how much is the thing. So I think having those conversations earlier on with coaches is important because when you're trying to have them in the heat of the moment, it never ends well. You're
No.
kind of on the back foot as it is.
But the reality of that as well is a lot of it can be results like, can't it? So
Yeah,
you can make
100%. Yeah.
decisions in, like you say, in the heat in the moment, put on a session the next day or whatever it's going to be, because that's what they did within their careers, or they just see that it's the right fit for a poor performance or whatever. But as a coach, then it falls on your shoulders to understand that, accept it, whether you get involved in the discussion and the debate or not, whether you should or shouldn't do it, it's probably going to happen. So then you have to have the skills to adapt things going forward, don't you? That's the big part.
Yeah, and that's understanding your role. Again,
Yeah.
younger coaches, I think you do generally start off in your career and think you're maybe a little bit more important than you actually are. You know, you do kind of when the team wins, you think you're the best in the world, and then when the team loses, you're just unlucky. Or it's nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
Whereas you do kind of realize that you're just a small part of a big thing, and you just have to kind of do your part as well as you can. And if coaches decide to make decisions that are against what you would recommend or what's best, sometimes you have to accept it. But I suppose the big thing I thought I probably improved on later in my career was how to get the points across, without offending the coach or saying it in the right way. And I suppose the best advice I was given at one stage was, if you have an idea around something that the coach might initially be against, try and make them think that it's their idea because coaches like all people, especially in sport, there's a lot of egos there. So
Yeah.
if you have a good idea, sometimes you might be instead of trying to convince the coach to go with your idea, you might be better off making them think it's their idea. And then generally they're kind of happier to go along with that.
I think that's a great point. And how you go about that, obviously, there's probably a few different ways of doing it, but it's a really good point, isn't it? Because then it becomes a real easy win. Do you feel
Yeah.
like with that, it's like a little nudge towards it? So it's obviously not just one discussion where you're just going to try and convince them with that. Is that just like a constant nudge towards making a decision?
Yeah, I think if you go like again, you have to understand that like the manager's job is on the line, So if you go to them with some drastic change that you want to make all of a sudden, to the training, even if it's the best idea in the world, straight away they're going to be thinking, well, hang on, they're probably going to think more so of the negatives. What if this doesn't work? Or this is taking this amount of time away from the football side of things, and we need to work on this. So they're going to straight away, be a little bit more guarded towards the idea. So I suppose a gradual introduction to anything as opposed to just wholesale changes straight away is probably going to go down better. And another, I suppose, if there is something, I suppose that's uh, maybe more of a bigger change to the structure of things. Even if let's say as big as changing the day of training, I think getting the other staff members on board is a really good thing. I've been kind of quite fortunate to work with like physio teams and medical teams that I've got along with. So, you can kind of work in a way that I suppose if everybody goes to even the coaching team, not just the manager, but the coaching team in general, with the same idea at different times, and gradually introduces that thought process in there, it's a little bit easier than me going up to the manager and saying, "Oh, I think we should do this," because a lot of times, unless you have a very good relationship, you're going to be kind of met with a little bit of, well, probably more than a bit of hesitation.
Mm. Yeah, there's a bit of subliminal messaging going on, isn't there?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah,
I think it's a great point. It's a really important point because that's reality, and that's going to be reality of some of the discussions you have. And like you said, it's not just going to be a case of going in and trying to make that change all in one go. It's gonna come from time, isn't it?
yeah,
Um,
exactly. Yeah.
Graham, I wanted to get your perspective. So, looking at both your sort of experience now on the rehab side with what you're doing, but also your time in football. We spoke in our community and on our social media around Mikel Arteta's interview recently, and he was talking about like the demands that the players are going through and the sort of time to prepare players between games. And there's obviously clubs now, as we record this, that have gone through off-season periods and not really had an off-season period because tournaments have gone on, and now they're getting hit with a lot of injuries. What's your sort of reflection on that? So looking at the rehab side and your time in football, with this restriction on time, and you obviously mentioned dealing with the team in the Europa League as well, so added fixtures in there as well. What are some key things that you feel like we need to focus on? So we know that injuries are going to happen, but is there anything that we need to focus on a little bit more to try and restrict that as much as we can?
I still think, again, this is just to say my opinion here, and it's, maybe become a little bit stronger on it since leaving football, but I still think there's just so much wasted time in football in terms of the touch points you have with players. I think a lot of the exercises or drills, that we're still doing, a couple from 10 years ago, like I would be kind of a big proponent of some of the stuff like the work of like Jared McMahon, like he's kind of coming out with some of his articles around, activation or what is activation. Like players all love their activation work or their this type of stuff, a lot of mini bands, but none of it's done with any kind of real focus or purpose. It's just to kind of get them to make them feel like they're ready versus actually, okay, what are we doing that's focused here, actually strengthen the areas that we need to strengthen for, let's say, the injuries that we're seeing, over the last couple of weeks or whatever it might be. I still think there's a lot of fluff in the preparation of football players. That is, a lot of it is to do with managers like seeing it done, players like doing it. And then as coaches, we're then trying to kind of work with the rest of the time, whereas if we could really structure the week in terms of the time we have with them, remove a lot of the stuff that we know from all the research that's done. An exercise might have no benefit whatsoever. Now, I do see the point of, you have to do certain things that players like, but once it doesn't, I suppose, take away from the time of actually preparing them for, all the demands that they're going to go through. That would have been a big frustration of mine, I suppose, towards the end of my football career, if you want to call it that. I don't want to say the end. I still have a chance. I'm not that old yet. But towards the end of my current time in football, I was just becoming more and more frustrated by it. Managers asking me to do certain things, or players, want certain things. And again, I would have given little bits of, what they liked, a little bit of kind of mini bands in the match day one, even though I didn't really feel like I was doing that for them. They liked it and make them feel a bit better. That's fine. But I still feel like there's so much stuff that I think coaches maybe feel they have to do because it's what all the other teams do.
Yeah.
And I know if you mention kind of more strength, people will say, oh well, players are stronger than ever. But I don't. When I say strength, I don't mean in terms of strength in like the your deadlifts, squats. But I think if we could again use that time for strengthening some of the smaller muscles in a more structured way, that wouldn't generally affect the soreness of the players like overall, or really from a fatigue point of view. If we could just remove some of the exercise that aren't really doing anything and replace them with some variations of even some like isometrics becoming more popular, which is great. Some lower level like running mechanic stuff probably going to be more beneficial than a couple of band exercises. Drip feeding that stuff in place of, I suppose, some of the fluff that we all know is there is probably going to have a pretty big impact. But again, I feel the issue would be if you're trying to add that stuff on top of the fluff, then all of a sudden you're taking 40 minutes to the start of the session and the manager's not happy with you, the players are happy with you, and it never really works.
Man, I think it's a great point. And I think everyone listening can probably look at their program and just critically sort of analyze how much time is spent on that fluff, because it's a really important point that when we've talked about player buy-in and all the rest of it, we might need to put some of that in, because that sort of gets them in the room, doesn't it? That gets them attention. But if that's taking up 30, 40, 50% of a day or a session or all the rest of it, that's when it becomes an issue, isn't it? It needs to be a small percentage. So I think it's a really good point. And I think looking at the basics and how well we're doing those basics is important, isn't it? And that's going to hopefully lead on to benefits elsewhere.
Exactly, yeah.
Mate, brilliant. Graham, that was a really interesting chat. I think there's loads of areas we could have probably gone into a bit more. So I'd love to have you back on at some point. We can maybe dive into some of those topics. But I really appreciate you coming on. I know you've got
no problem at all.
You mentioned there you got a lot going on.
A little bit, yeah.
Do you want to just give us, if there's anywhere that people want to reach out, they've got questions on anything, or even just the facility, like is there anywhere where you'd send people to sort of get in touch?
Well, just I said my own page on social media is just Graham_New Era, and then the business is New Era Coaching. I said that's what kind of everything is kind of lean towards, is the content we put out. I suppose it's a little bit more personal on my own page, and then I suppose it's more small group personal training, general population focused on the business page. But if anyone wants to reach out, I suppose that would be probably the best place to go.
Brilliant. Really appreciate coming on. Thank you, mate.
Cheers, Ben. Thanks a million.